A trucker shoved a 77-year-old veteran like he was nobody. 45 minutes later, a military helicopter landed, and with it came a response the whole town would never forget. It happened in the parking lot of Wallace's Diner, just past noon on a Thursday, the kind of day when the only real noise is silverware clinking inside and the occasional diesel engine outside. But that quiet shattered when Travis Minton, trucker with a short fuse and too much caffeine in his veins, pushed an old man hard, so hard that he stumbled backward into the curb. A few gasps escaped, someone dropped a fork, but no one moved. The old man's name was Ray Dawson. He wore a threadbare army cap, the kind folks saw every morning as he sipped his black coffee at the same window seat. Most assumed he was just another retiree stuck in old habits. Nobody expected him to get shoved like a bag of trash in front of 10 witnesses, and worse, no one stepped in. Travis cursed under his breath and strutted off, leaving Ray to collect his dignity from the pavement. Ray didn't say much. He brushed himself off slowly, breathing hard but steady. A moment later, he walked to the edge of the lot, opened a weathered flip phone, and made a single call. No anger, no yelling, just a calm voice saying 5 words. "It's time, I need you." 45 minutes later, the skies over Wallace rumbled. Helicopter blades sliced the air as a military chopper descended onto the nearby field. Doors opened. Men in uniform stepped out with purpose. What followed left everyone in that diner stunned, not just because of who Ray Dawson turned out to be, but because of the quiet force of respect that followed in his wake. Ray Dawson came to Wallace's Diner every morning at 7:30 sharp. He always ordered the same thing: black coffee, 1 poached egg, and dry wheat toast. He sat at the corner booth by the window, closest to the entrance, where the sunlight hit the table just right and he could watch the trucks roll by on Route 52. The waitresses called him Mr. Ray and didn't bother with a menu. He tipped well, smiled rarely, and read the paper front to back, even the classifieds. To most folks, he was invisible in that comfortable way older men often become. Not mysterious enough to be interesting, not loud enough to be annoying, just there. A regular fixture, like the faded Coke machine near the restrooms. A couple of the younger guys from the lumberyard joked that he was a retired librarian or maybe an insurance adjuster. Nobody guessed anything close to the truth. Ray didn't talk much about himself. He'd nod politely when someone mentioned the weather or asked how the toast was, but he never offered anything deeper. What little people knew came in scraps. He lived alone, in a modest house near the edge of town, had no known family nearby, and drove an old blue Chevy truck that still had a faded Vietnam service medal decal on the bumper. Most assumed he just liked the routine, the comfort of familiarity in a world moving way too fast. But every so often, someone caught him doing something odd. Once, a delivery guy tripped on the icy steps out front, and Ray, despite his age, moved with startling speed to catch him. Another time, when a car backfired loudly outside, Ray flinched so hard he nearly dropped his coffee, and more than one person had noticed the scar's faint, white lines along his hands and wrists. Like old barbed wire stories he never told. Even so, no one pressed him. It wasn't their business. He was just Ray, quiet, predictable, polite. That morning though, something felt off. Ray stared at his untouched toast longer than usual. His hand trembled ever so slightly when he reached for the cup, and he kept glancing at the window, watching the trucks with a gaze that wasn't curious. It was calculating. When Travis Minton pulled up in his 18-wheeler and slammed the door behind him, Ray's eyes followed him in. The booth suddenly felt smaller. The room somehow colder. He folded his paper, set down his mug, and for the first time anyone there could remember, Ray Dawson stood up. And in that small, deliberate motion, the gears of something long dormant began to turn, as if the past, buried deep for decades, had just been given a reason to rise. Travis Minton had been on the road for 14 hours straight. He was behind schedule, low on nicotine patches, and his air conditioning had sputtered out somewhere near Laramie. By the time he pulled his rig, a scuffed-up Peterbilt he called Lucille, into the Wallace's Diner lot, his patience was as thin as the tread on his rear tires. He wasn't a bad man, not in the way people think of evil. But Travis had a short fuse and a long list of excuses. He'd been through 2 divorces, 3 trucking companies, and at least a dozen temp gigs before settling into long-haul freight. People annoyed him, rules annoyed him, and the older generation, especially got under his skin. Think they built the damn roads we drive on, he muttered, slamming the truck door and stomping toward the diner. Inside, his boots hit the floor with the force of someone who wanted to be noticed. He was tall, broad-chested, with a thick beard and a faded Sons of Anarchy t-shirt that didn't help his first impression. He barked something about coffee to the waitress and scanned the booths like a dog sizing up territory. That's when he saw Ray. The old man was standing, unusually upright for someone his age, with his paper neatly folded under one arm. Travis didn't like the look he got. Not hostile, not challenging, just ... steady. Calm. It ticked him off. Move, Travis said, gesturing with his thumb toward the booth. Ray blinked once. Plenty of seats open. Didn't ask for plenty. I want this one. There was a pause. Not long, but long enough for attention to settle like dust. Ray didn't budge. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "Then I suggest you sit somewhere else." That was it. A fuse caught. Travis shoved him. It wasn't dramatic, just a quick, forceful push to the chest. But Ray was 77 years old. He stumbled back, his heel catching the edge of the booth's tile, and landed hard against the floor. A gasp rippled through the diner. Silverware clinked. Coffee cups froze mid-air. But no one moved. Travis didn't even look twice. He dropped into the booth like he owned it, smirked at the waitress, and asked for extra bacon. Behind him, Ray lay still for a second longer than he should have. Then slowly, steadily, he pushed himself up as he stood, one hand gripping the edge of the table, his other reached, not for support, but for the pocket, where an old, worn flip phone waited. And something in his eyes had changed. Wallace's diner had seen its share of arguments, truckers late on payments, teenagers mouthing off, even the occasional awkward breakup. But what happened that Thursday silenced the entire room in a way no one could explain. After Ray hit the floor, time seemed to stutter. People looked at one another, hoping someone else would act first. In the booth near the jukebox, an older couple paused mid-bite, eyes wide. At the counter, a waitress gripped the coffee pot with both hands, like it might anchor her to the moment. A college-aged server, new to town, mumbled, "Is he okay?" but never moved an inch. And still, no one intervened. There was no screaming, no outrage, just the kind of paralyzing quiet that fills a room when something deeply wrong happens in plain view, and everyone feels, on some level, complicit. Travis acted like nothing had happened. He reached for a ketchup bottle, shook it hard, and began pouring it onto his hash browns, like he hadn't just shoved a senior citizen to the ground. His jaw worked methodically as he chewed, his eyes scanning the menu like this was any other pit stop. The booth now seemed too small for his presence, disdained by his ego. Ray, for his part, said nothing. He stood slowly, brushing bits of tile grit from his slacks, adjusting the collar of his jacket. He looked around once, not pleading for help, not searching for sympathy, just ... registering. Each face he met turned away. He didn't limp, though maybe he wanted to. He didn't glare, though maybe he should have. Instead, he walked with purpose through the side exit, the small bell on the door jingling weakly behind him like an apology. Outside, the heat had begun to rise. Asphalt shimmered in waves. The field adjacent to the lot buzzed with cicadas. Ray stood by his truck for a moment, head lowered, then reached into his coat and pulled out a battered flip phone. He opened it with a slow, practiced motion. The screen blinked to life. There were only 5 numbers stored. He hovered over one labeled Red Hawk, then pressed call. No one inside the diner noticed. They were all too busy doing what people do best, in awkward moments, pretending nothing happened, hoping it would all just pass. But 45 minutes later, when the sky cracked open with the sound of approaching rotors, every head in Wallace's would snap toward the windows, and all that silence would turn to dread. The call lasted less than 30 seconds. Ray stood behind his truck, shielded from the diner windows, and held the phone close like it was something sacred. His hand shook slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to awaken. The line picked up after a single ring, a woman's voice calm and clipped. "Red Hawk, go ahead. It's Dawson," he said quietly. "I'm activating the failsafe." A pause, then, without hesitation, "Understood. Are you secure?" Ray glanced toward the diner, watching Travis laugh at something on his phone. "Secure enough. I'll be at grid 0 in 10. Confirmed. ETA 45. Prepare for retrieval." The line clicked dead. Ray closed the phone and stared at it for a moment, the screen fading to black. He hadn't spoken to Red Hawk in years, not since the last reunion, when most of the old crew had gray hair, bad knees, and stories no one would ever believe. They were scattered now, retired, forgotten, but the failsafe was their promise to one another. If one of them ever needed backup, real backup, they'd show up. No questions, no politics, just boots on the ground. He sat on the tailgate of his truck, the sun hot on his back, and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His heart pounded, not from the fall, but from the weight of memory. The last time he'd used a helicopter for anything, it had been to pull 6 men out of a rice paddy under heavy fire. This time, it was just him, an old man with a bruised hip and a bruised sense of dignity. But he wasn't angry, he wasn't even hurt. He was disappointed, not just in Travis, but in the crowd, in the silence, in the slow erosion of something he'd spent his whole life defending, the idea that dignity was something we protected in each other. Inside the diner, no one noticed he was gone. The waitress finally brought Travis his bacon. The regulars resumed their conversations in hushed tones, as if maybe they could erase what they'd seen with enough small talk. But something had shifted in the air. Birds took off in startled flocks from the trees lining the road. Dogs began barking in a sudden, synchronized wave through town, and far off, just barely audible, came the rhythmic, unmistakable thump of rollerblades. Ray looked up at the sky, narrowed his eyes, and whispered to himself, "They're coming." Not as a threat, but as a quiet reckoning. At exactly 1:17 p.m., the town of Marlow Ridge looked up. First, it was just a dull vibration, like thunder rolling in from the west. Then came the tremble in the coffee cups, the rattling of silverware, a low-frequency hum that crawled up the spine before reaching the ears. Inside Wallace's diner, conversation died mid-sentence. One man stood instinctively, eyes squinting toward the window. Then came the sound. Not the soft whir of a news chopper, not the light flutter of a medevac. This was heavy, military, and unmistakable growl, the kind that makes veterans shift in their seats and children press their hands to their ears. Travis looked up from his plate, fork frozen in midair. "What the hell is that?" No one answered. Every face turned toward the front window, where a swirl of dust began to rise in the open field across from the diner. Plates clattered as people scrambled out of booths. The cook stepped outside, apron flapping like a flag in the breeze. The helicopter emerged through the haze like a ghost from a war movie. Matte black, no visible markings, twin rotors, a design not seen by most civilians in decades. It hovered low over the field for a moment, sending grass and gravel flying. Then, with surgical precision, it touched down, blades still whirring, slicing the air with mechanical rhythm. Ray stood nearby, hat in hand, as calm as if he were waiting for a bus. Doors swung open. 3 figures stepped out in staggered formation. 2 men, 1 woman, all in full uniform, but without name tags or ranks. Their movements were tight, deliberate. The woman at the front scanned the area, then walked directly toward Ray, stopping just short of him. "Colonel Dawson," she said, loud enough for everyone outside to hear, "we're here at your request. What are your orders?" Ray didn't speak right away. He looked at her, then at the growing crowd, and finally at the diner. The people who had watched him fall were now watching something else entirely, a transformation, a reckoning, a reality they hadn't expected. This wasn't just some old man in a camo hat. He was someone who could summon thunder from the sky. And inside the diner, Travis Minton took a single, nervous step back, suddenly unsure whether he was still the biggest man in the room. Ray didn't say much. He didn't need to, as the 3 uniformed operatives flanked him. The townspeople poured out of the diner like moths toward a flame. Phones hovered in the air. Mouths gaped. A few whispered, "Who is he?" as if trying to summon an answer that might explain what they were witnessing. Travis remained inside, arms crossed, trying to maintain the swagger that now felt oddly flimsy. Ray adjusted his posture, shoulders back, feet planted firm, the stance of a man used to briefing teams before missions, not sipping coffee alone in a small-town diner. The woman beside him, Agent Keller, turned toward the crowd and spoke with the authority of someone used to commanding rooms. "This man is Colonel Raymond Dawson, U.S. Army, retired, commander of Operation Iron Echo, 2-time Bronze Star recipient, POW survivor, decorated strategist and combat veteran." A collective inhale moved through the crowd like a breeze. 26 years of active service, 12 overseas deployments, led extraction units in Southeast Asia and the Middle East. This town may know him as a quiet patron with a favorite booth, but to us, and to the men and women who lived because of him, he is something far more. Somewhere in the back, a woman dropped her phone. Travis scoffed from inside the diner. So what? He's still just some old man who got in my way. Agent Keller heard it. So did Ray. She didn't respond. Instead, she opened a black case she'd brought with her, velvet lined, containing a single item, an old, dust-covered green beret. She handed it to Ray without a word. Ray held it like something sacred. The texture of the wool brought memories flooding back of jungle humidity, night operations, the low hum of a radio crackling with coordinates that meant life or death. He put it on. It didn't sit quite the same on his white hair, but it belonged there. Now, more than ever. And in that moment, the man everyone had overlooked became fully visible, not just as a veteran, but as a symbol of something the town had let itself forget: quiet strength, lived sacrifice, and the kind of presence that doesn't need to raise a voice to command a room. Then Ray stepped forward, not toward the operatives, but toward the diner, locking eyes with the man who had shoved him, and the air around them thickened like a storm was about to break. The crowd parted like a tide as Ray approached the diner. Boots scuffed asphalt, cameras stopped clicking, even the birds quieted as if the air itself was holding its breath. Travis sat frozen in the corner booth, a half-eaten strip of bacon limp in his fingers. When Ray opened the diner door, the bell chimed like it always did, soft and ordinary, but this time it felt like a drumbeat. Ray didn't speak at first. He simply looked at Travis, not with anger, not with pity, just a long, steady gaze that pinned Travis harder than any shout ever could. Agent Keller and her team stepped inside behind him, crisp uniforms contrasting against the wood-paneled walls and vinyl booths. The cook, the waitresses, the regulars, everyone stood still, as if waiting for a verdict. "Colonel Dawson," Keller said loud enough for all to hear, "it is my honor, on behalf of those who served under you and those who served because of you, to formally recognize your legacy in the presence of your community." She turned to the room. This man was once buried behind enemy lines for 13 days with no backup. He led his injured team out with no food, no water, and no air support. He called in his own airstrike, on his own position, to save their lives. And today, he was pushed to the ground by a man who didn't recognize the greatness that once walked among him. A wave of discomfort spread through the room. Eyes dropped. A few people shifted guiltily. Ray's expression didn't change. He didn't bask in the moment. He didn't swell with pride. He just nodded once, not in acceptance, but as if to say, "That's enough." But Keller wasn't done. She reached into her coat and removed a small, rectangular case. Inside was a folded citation, recently updated and signed, a commendation of continued valor and community service. She placed it on the diner counter, where it caught the light, unmistakable and real. The silence now was heavier than before, because it wasn't just about Travis anymore. It was about everyone in that diner, about the failure to recognize quiet nobility, the failure to stand up when it mattered, and the weight of a town's silence now reflected back at them. And yet, in all the ceremony and attention, Ray turned to Travis and asked just one question, low, steady, and unforgettable. "What would you have done if it had been your father on the floor?" Travis Minton didn't have an answer. Not one that would have sounded right. Not one he could speak aloud with a diner full of people staring at him, with military uniforms flanking the man he'd shoved. And with a question hanging in the air like smoke. What would you have done if it had been your father on the floor? His throat clenched. The food in his stomach curdled. For the first time in a long while, Travis wasn't the loudest man in the room. He wasn't a man at all, just a kid again, caught doing something wrong and suddenly aware of it. He looked at Ray. Really looked. There were lines in Ray's face that told stories not just of age, but of hardship endured, choices made, people lost. The kind of lines you earn. Travis had never earned anything that way. He'd fought for attention, barked for respect, pushed others to make room for himself, never once imagining that the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, may already lived through more than he could ever handle. He stood up slowly, knocking over a half-full coffee cup. No one flinched. "I didn't know," Travis mumbled, eyes down. Ray nodded once. "That's the problem. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't sharp. It was just, true." Travis turned toward the exit. He didn't rush, didn't slam the door. He walked past the crowd like a man peeling off his armor, one piece at a time. And as he stepped outside into the harsh sunlight, something shifted behind his eyes, a crack in the bluster, a trace of shame. Not because he'd been punished, but because he'd finally seen himself clearly, back inside. Ray stood alone for a moment. Keller and her team didn't follow Travis. They didn't need to. What had happened was never about retaliation. It was about recognition. A young man near the counter, barely 20, approached Ray awkwardly. "Sir," he said, "my grandfather served in Desert Storm. He passed last year. I think he would have wanted me to say thank you." Ray offered the faintest smile. "Then I'll accept it in his honor." And as the young man extended his hand, others followed, one by one, people stepping forward, not to erase what had happened, but to begin rewriting what would come next. The helicopter was gone, the dust had settled, the town's heartbeat slowed. Wallace's diner returned to its ordinary rhythm, coffee refills, the smell of bacon, the low hum of conversation, but something in the air had changed, like a page had turned and wouldn't be flipped back. Ray didn't stay for long. He slipped out before the lunch crowd returned, giving a polite nod to the waitress, who used to bring his toast without asking. This time, she offered him his meal on the house. He declined. Outside, the sky was wide and blue. Ray walked to his truck, the same faded Chevy he'd driven for years, and slid into the driver's seat like it was part of him. The flip phone lay on the dash, closed again, its screen dark. He didn't call anyone. He didn't need to. He'd said what needed saying with his silence, with his calm, with his presence. The town would talk about that day for years, not just the helicopter, not just the uniforms, but the man they thought they knew and never truly saw. They'd tell it like a local legend. The time a trucker shoved an old vet and a military chopper landed like divine justice. But for Ray, it wasn't about revenge. It never had been. He wasn't interested in teaching lessons. He was interested in reminding people of something they'd forgotten, that dignity isn't worn like a badge, and respect doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits quietly at a booth by the window, sipping black coffee and watching the world roll by. Later that week, someone left a small bouquet of wildflowers on his table. No note, just a quiet gesture. The following month, a plaque appeared on the wall near the booth, in honor of Colonel Raymond Dawson, protector, patriot, patron. He never acknowledged it, but every morning, he sat beneath it with the same calm expression, sipping his coffee, reading his paper, and though most still walked past him without knowing, a few, just a few, now stopped, looked twice, and nodded, as if they'd finally learned to see what was always there.
If you've made it this far, it means this story touched you in some way. So don't leave without subscribing. It really helps the channel and keeps me motivated to share more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And which part of this story moved you the most?